Welcome to Conflict to Connection, the podcast that helps families navigate separation with compassion and understanding. I'm Mitch, a child consultant at Civilized Separations, and I'm joined by my co-hosts, Bill and Bella. Together, we tackle tough conversations about divorce, co-parenting, and creating healthier family dynamics. Whether you're navigating a separation or just looking for better ways to connect, this podcast is here to guide you every step of the way. And today, we are exploring the topic of attachment theory. As always, I'm joined by Bill, a post-separation family repair specialist and founder of Civilized Separations with decades of experience as a mediator, and Bella, lead child consultant at Civilized Separations with years of experience working in child-inclusive mediation. So our topic is attachment theory, and I'm sure in terms of having studied psychology, we talk about attachment theory all the time, but I feel like the media is picking up more about what attachment styles are. You know, you can kind of do little quizzes of what is your attachment style and all of that. But for listeners who don't know, can we quickly explain what attachment theory is and what attachment styles are?
Oh,
I was thinking about how someone the other day I was listening to saying you shouldn't really be calling it attachment theory anymore because it still sort of implies that it's a theory, like many others. But I think attachment theories or attachment has, as an idea, been around a very long time, and it's survived multiple eras of a sort of thought about psychology. You know, it's still around, and it seems so intuitively, innately right that I think it's probably okay to not call it attachment theory anymore, to call it
attachment fact.
Attachment fact. Yeah. So John Bowlby, who kind of was the one who pretty much created the idea, and many people have followed on from that. I think he was around. He was looking at children not long after the end of the Second World War, so he was seeing a lot of children in environments where they lost family or the family was seriously disrupted, and he was looking at how the children were dealing with that and started to notice that children developed a mechanism of interacting with a caregiver that seemed to depend upon the caregiver's capacity to give attunement and to be creating in the child a sense of safety and a sense of being thoroughly got. And he was noticing that children were varying how they interacted with that parent according to the quality of the parenting they were getting, and how that became part of their psyche in a way. It created this experiment where a child would be with usually a mother in a room, and a stranger would walk in, and then the mother would leave the child with the stranger, and then the mother would come back in again, and they were looking at how the children responded to that environment, because I guess in being a child, having your parents kind of leave and someone else in the room would create a sense of unease. So they were looking at how did the child deal with that, how good were they at calming themselves down when they were upset, how did they respond to the parent when the parent came back, how did they respond when the parent left. He broke it down to kind of 3 or maybe 4 attachment sort of styles, one being avoidant, which meant that the child kind of responded in a way where they seemed to not be particularly affected by what was going on. And then he noticed another style, which was an anxious attachment style, which meant that they became very upset, and some would take a very long time to be consoled. And some developed, and some demonstrated behavior that he described as disorganized, and that was where the child would act in very incongruent ways in terms of this stuff that was going on. But there was kind of a deep sort of sense of kind of trauma that was coming with the behavior. So he sort of broke it down. I think he was saying like something like 45% of the society sort of seemed to be demonstrating some sort of degree of attachment trauma. And that the attachment, once you've kind of created a certain type of attachment relationship with your caregiver, and you might have a different type of attachment with 2 different parents because they're different to you, then they become part of your being. They become part of your makeup. If you develop an avoidant mechanism to manage a parent, then that becomes how you manage your relationships more broadly in your life.
So when we talk about attachment and attachment theory, in terms of separation and family repair, it's important because it manifests into your relationships. Is that right?
Yeah, so an attachment trauma will have affected the parents, which is why the relationship went the way it went. And then attachment will be playing out in the children in response to that. So the parents' attachment traumas result in the children's attachment traumas, and on it goes.
Right.
And I suppose the one that you're really hoping for your children is the secure attachment, which is where...
Oh, yes, we have to. There is a good one. Yeah.
There is a good one.
That's right.
And that's where, as a child, your parents became very, very attuned to your needs. And you grew up in that kind of environment where your parents thought very, very highly of you. They thought highly of each other as well, because as we know, you want to look after your children, look after each other, but also that your needs were always met. They were always prioritized. And that's in sort of so if you think of a baby playing with its mother in a high chair or something like that, and the baby starts to show signs that they're kind of finished with this type of play, or they're starting to become a bit agitated. They might move in their chair. They might start to look upset. And if the mother is responding to that and say, okay, yeah, you need your space, I'll let you go, or we'll change this game, we'll do something else, or just kind of reading the baby very well and changing their behavior to suit the baby, then that will lead to a secure attachment. But if there's sort of the mother's not able to pick up on those cues, and the baby starts crying, and the whole thing starts to become stressful, then obviously there can be some incongruence there. So in terms of the work that we do, but also just generally, trying to create humans that are more attuned to people and able to pick up on social cues and things, it really starts when you're young. It starts with how your parents respond to your needs and how they prioritize your needs.
I see. So those attachment styles can come into the conflict that you have as a partner.
Yeah.
So that in turn creates difficulties or strengths, if that's a secure attachment, in your next relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Because you're able to pick up on their cues as well. So if you've been shown that as you've been growing up, if your parents have actually demonstrated it to you, and they've shown signs of compassion for each other and for you, and they also know how to negotiate, and they can have their voice heard, but then it's always a collaborative outcome, and you're always being prioritized. In a sense, you're just as important in this family. And if we're going to say no to something, we're going to give you reasons because we respect you, and we're going to make sure that you understand sort of where we're coming from and why it's important to prioritize your safety. And then if you're in a relationship when you're older, and your partner is trying to get a sense of how much they matter to you, you're able to give that to them because you saw that in your upbringing. It was demonstrated, so it became part of your relationship template, something that you can provide for people. So you'll very likely have successful relationships with a secure attachment.
So in terms of if you have an avoidant attachment or any of the more negative ones that you were talking about, what does that determine for a future relationship? What would that look like? Do people consciously know that they have these attachments, and that ends up being the case in their
I mean,
relationship?
that's the problem. I think they don't know. They kind of see the effect of their attachment on another person. But if they lack insight into what's happening for that person, they might jump to very simplistic conclusions about why that person's doing what they're doing. So they might be avoidant.
Right.
I think you've got to be a pretty robust character to kind of be in a relationship with someone who has attachment trauma, because they are profoundly affected by it. And you, as the partner of that person, are going to have to deal with an awful lot of stuff that's not going to be pleasant to be around. So the avoidant person will shut the conversation down just as you're starting to kind of get to speak about how you feel.
Mm.
And then that could be interpreted as I'm not remotely interested in what you have to say. You know, I don't really value that much. I don't respect your intelligence. I don't think you have anything to offer. You know, you've got to be a pretty tough character to kind of be effectively told, I don't want to hear what you've got to say without taking it personally. So,
Mm.
and of course, the person that you're interacting with has got an attachment history of their own. And so everybody's kind of getting hurt by the meaning they make about the other person's behavior that's driven by their attachment. Classically, you'll often get an avoidant and an anxious people in a relationship with each other because the avoidant person loves the fact that the other one's very prepared to express themselves and clear the air and, you know, have things out there. They quite like that. And the anxious person likes the fact the avoidant person isn't, you know, is provoking their anxiety by making a fuss, you know, so they're kind of attracted to each other. But then, of course, as the relationship starts to fail them and starts to highlight their differences as problems or indications of, you know, not liking them, then it just compounds. So if you don't have awareness about your attachment schema and what effect it's having on other people, you won't be able to repair it because you don't know why it's happening. And you will sort of inevitably end up losing love.
Of course, nobody wants that. So in terms of how do you become aware of an attachment style or conflict style due to an attachment style, and how do you fix that? How do we change our attachment style? Can we change our attachment style in that way?
I think we can become more aware of them.
Okay.
I think there's two things that has to happen. One is an internal process where you gain deeper insight into yourself. Notice things about yourself. If you're really sort of busy in your head, I was kind of thinking about this the other day when people are never having a moment of peace and calm where they're just going from one thing to the next. And if they ever have a quiet moment, they sort of plug their ear pods in and start listening to something. So they never have quiet moments. And I think the downside of that is you don't have a moment where you can notice stuff that actually does require quiet. You've got to be really kind of in a very calm and peaceful place before you notice things about yourself. Otherwise, you're just getting through the day and being really busy. And you've always got something going on. You don't have a moment of, oh, I hadn't thought of that. So I think that instilling in yourself an opportunity to kind of find that degree of insight through calm and quiet is an important thing to offer yourself. In addition to that, if you're in a relationship with someone, you can have a mechanism in place to address the fact that you do tend to respond that way to a particular thing. So, for instance, you might know that you become very sensitive to criticism of a particular type. So if you can instruct your relationship to be aware of that and say, look, when we talk about this type of topic, could you frame it this way? It would really help me because I tend to sort of react very strongly to comments like that by taking it personally. It's just part of my attachment history and it's just there and it's very innate. It's very deeply set within me. I can't access it easily. So if we could have a mechanism, a structure whereby when we're together, you always approach that particular conversation in a way that I do like. It sends me a message to say I'm safe and I'm well thought of and I don't need to access my attachment strategy. The thing about attachment is you don't see it until someone's under duress. It doesn't come to the fore if someone's fine. You only get to see their attachment schema play out when they're under what they call mild to moderate stress or extreme stress. So if you have a stress response in your relationship that takes into account your attachment expectation, you can head it off before it becomes a problem. You just have to say to that person something that makes them think, this is not something that makes me feel unsafe. The way you framed it makes me feel, you're telling me something I need to know, but I don't feel unsafe. So I won't access my attachment mechanism to help myself cope because I feel safe. And we won't therefore miscue each other. So you can do an internal process of becoming more aware of yourself, but also an external systemic process whereby you've got a mechanism in place to address that fact that you know you have that propensity.
is this a factor of kind of going to therapy or just doing a lot of mindfulness, kind of being more self-reflective in general, being more aware of oneself and our actions and our behaviors and how they may stem from stuff in our childhood? I'm sure everybody has a thought of, oh, I sound a lot like my mum there, or like, that's what my dad used to do, or, is that a process that you can do on your own, or is that something that you always kind of have to go to a therapist to find, help me find my attachment style?
I think the therapist might be helpful because it's like a position of kind of observation, I suppose, where you can kind of see something playing out, like you might be talking to a therapist, might be talking to a client, and the client might be demonstrating their attachment schema through a response to something. So the therapist might say, imagine blah. And the client goes, well, I straight away think of this. So the therapist can see, oh, that's interesting. You went straight to that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder to be aware of the fact that you do that when you're just by yourself. But if you also do give yourself the gift of calm and peace, you do create an opportunity for you to notice that, because you're calmer, there's less noise going on in your head, so you can think to yourself, that's interesting. I note that when everyone ever mentions such and such a topic, I always feel this urge to defend myself, or I always feel the urge to attack them, or I always feel an urge to kind of give them another point of view. What is that? Where's that come from? So it's just allowing that piece of knowledge that your mind's got in it, but usually not allowed to let you hear. There's like the bit of brain that's very good at reflection is very quiet and deferential. It doesn't loudly push its way in and say, there's something you need to know. The bit of brain that's kind of ticking over all the time, this constant sort of narrative, this constant noise, what they call sort of chattering monkeys that we have, in this day and age, this sort of busy world, we've got very busy brains. That brain will always dominate given the opportunity. The only way that the brain that's got wisdom about relationships and personal insight, the only way that bit of brain's ever going to have a voice is if you shut up and give it an opportunity to speak. Because it will, as soon as it hears some other story, it'll just back off. Now's not the moment.
Do you think that's quite difficult for people to, I think it's quite difficult for people in these times to have a moment of calm and self-reflection. They don't allow themselves for that because it induces anxiety, I think, for people.
Yeah.
I also think it's quite difficult for people to be that self-reflective like that, because I think it brings out in you what you don't necessarily want to know about yourself. I think it's quite hard to see, I do that. I am like this. When conflict comes up, I become quite aggressive. I'm the shark. I am the one that's attacking. I jump to conclusions quite quickly. Those are quite difficult things for someone to have the self-realization about. I feel like that's quite a struggle to get to that point.
I think it's like the ego. They say the ego is a great servant but a terrible master. And I think in a way, you're threatening the ego by saying, I'm going to investigate your origins and I'm going to look to see how you hold me and how well you look after me. It doesn't like the idea because it's going to lose its relevance. It's going to lose its power. So yeah, it will initially push back and say, no, you're wrong. You shouldn't have quiet because it'll be awful and be scary and terrible things will, you'll have horrible experiences. But that's just because it doesn't want to lose its tenure.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of, nonetheless, the thing about mindfulness or meditation is that the way you train your brain is by just saying to it, I'm just not going to go there right now. It's not rocket science. You just don't follow thoughts. So you don't have to have horrible thoughts. You just try and encourage yourself to have less thoughts.
Yeah. Yes. So when we're talking about attachment theory and kind of that cycle, that ongoing cycle of bad attachment or something like avoidant attachment, and then that creating an avoidant conflict style, and then that causing a conflictual relationship, and then in turn affecting your children by them maybe tuning on to that avoidant attachment and maybe having their own dysfunctional attachment style. How do we manage this circle or this cycle of bad attachments to bad conflicts. It's almost like a generational cycle that happens before us that just keeps going on and on and on and on. How do you kind of pull the plug, stop that from happening again?
Well, that's a really good question. And you just said circle, and it made me think of the circle of security. And I think it might be a good way to answer this question. So we're talking about sort of like breaking the cycle, I suppose, isn't it? If you picture a circle, and on the left-hand side of the sphere are these two hands like this, and they represent the parents. And then as the circle continues round, the children are going out and exploring their worlds, and they're going on adventures, and they're experimenting, and they're learning from things. They're testing the waters. They're figuring out their confidence, their bravery. And while they're exploring their world and they're looking back at their parents, if the parents are demonstrating a relationship whereby their attachment styles are very much at play because there's so much conflict. Because as Bill said, we see the attachment style come out when there's conflict. And if the relationship is quite conflictual, and let's say, for example, the mum is being very avoidant and the other mum is being extremely anxious, and the child is trying to live their lives, and they keep on looking back and seeing that continuous routine is just continuing with their parents, their ability to go out and explore their world becomes completely inhibited. In fact, they might even decide, I can't even continue around the circle. I have to go back and look after my parents. The good, I suppose, one really cool thing that you can do is find out from the child what happens to the parents when they've just had something to do with each other and it hasn't gone well. Because you see the conflict style and the attachment style play out. The child actually sees it. So if we paint the scenario and say, how does mum look when she's just had an argument with dad? How does she look? And the child might say, she just looks really down. She doesn't even look up at me. She just looks really down, really distracted, a bit sort of, beaten, I guess, And what do you do when that happens? You ask the child, okay, so what do you do when that happens? Well, I guess I might do the same thing because I don't really know what to do. So right there, we've seen a demonstration of the child picking up on the attachment style that the parent has, and they're implementing it into their own relationship template. If you can bring awareness to that then and there and say, okay, so this is what's happening to your child as a result of just having something to do with each other. So if we want to stop that, if we want to intervene and not allow that attachment style to start developing and continuing, let's change something about how you guys react to each other. Let's do something about the fact that when you have something to do with each other, you look down, you look beaten, you look forlorn, you look defeated. Let's change that. Let's stop looking like that. How do we stop looking like that? Well, we go back and look at the relationship and see what kind of conversations are you guys having in order to look like that? Why are you feeling triggered? What happened just now? Could we tweak the conversation? Could it be a little bit nicer, given the fact now that we know that your children are actually picking up on your attachment style and potentially implementing it into their own relationship template? Let's do something about that, because parents are always going to want their children to be successful relationship havers. They'll be happy and their children will be happy.
I think it really sort of highlights how incredibly simple the solution is. Going back to that idea that we are relational creatures and we're never busy. Our brains are never busier than when we're in relationship with another human. That's when we're using all of it. And we're very, very big on relationships. We make a lot of meaning of it. Now, when we're going really well in our lives, we're incredible. The things that we can achieve in relationship and otherwise is endless. But when we're not in good relationship, we are far less functional than the average zebra on the plains of Africa, because we bring all this existential angst in, and the needs we have to be nurtured are so high that if we don't get perfect nurturing, we're damaged. So if we get that recognition of value, if we feel heard, if we feel that we are welcome and we are of importance, we're okay.
Mm.
And I think this is constantly underplayed when we kind of look at how to kind of resolve dispute. We're not paying enough attention to the fact that the situation is all remedied by how it begins. If you get a cue that says, you matter, you'll be easy to deal with. It won't matter what the topic is. It might be a really big and difficult topic that you have very strong feelings about. But if you've had a message of value at the beginning of it, you'll be there, you'll be up for it, you'll be able to partake in the conversation.
Mm.
So the solution is almost ridiculously simple, because it will come down to the fact, as I was saying before, you said to someone, if you were loving the anticipation of a conversation that you were going to have with someone and there was something about their demeanor that made you think this is going to be amazing, what would they be doing? And eventually they say they would smile. That's all you need to know.
You're saying it's literally from the beginning, and you were saying, Bella, it's literally from the beginning of when we were young and developing. Do we have a secure base from our parents? Do we have this base that we can look back on and be like, okay, they're doing fine, I'll go out and play, or okay, they're doing fine, I'll go to uni and I'll be an astronaut or whatever.
Yeah.
And it happens again and again and again in lots of different ways, in the way that we function in our relationships as well later on in life. Do I have this secure base with them? Do we have this secure kind of baseline, flat line when I come into the house? Do we have these secure cues that we can cue each other well to develop off whatever a difficult conversation may be? If we start off with this secure base, if I'm comfortable in this space, we're responding well to each other, then actually going forward, that should be fine. I can go on and be really successful in my relationship, as I could go on and be really successful in my life.
Yeah.
Because of these initial first secure bases that you have.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's really all about that and how we...
And you can ask people 10 different questions about how someone else would be behaving if they were loving it. And they'll give you 10 different answers, but all those answers will be fitting with the same fundamental theme. We've all got a thing that really resonates with us. So if you talk to lots of people in conflict, mums and dads, and you'll hear from the dad, you know, if she was behaving towards you in a way that you really loved, what would she be doing or saying that led you to feel that way? He might say something like, she would compliment me on how good the kids looked. And you'd say, what is it about that you really like? Well, it makes me feel that she recognises and appreciates how much effort I put into kind of making sure that they're healthy and they're well dressed and they're well fed, etc. Okay, give us another example of what she'd be doing or saying that led you to feel that. He'll actually say something like that again, because that's his thing. And some people will say that the other parent would demonstrate a deep interest in the children's welfare. Like if I spoke to her, if I spoke to him, he would be saying something that makes me feel he's really attuned to the children. You know, he would say something about them in some sort of depth. He wouldn't just kind of explain them in some sort of generic way. He'd very specifically talk about that child and how that child feels and et cetera, et cetera. That would leave me to feel enormously safe when they're in his company. Knowing that he feels about them and is so attuned to them in that way makes me feel very relaxed about them being with him. And you could ask her 10 different questions and she'd sort of say that each time. So that's just something he needs to know. And it's not rocket science. He can laminate it, put it on the wall before he goes out.
Yeah.
You know, just make sure you speak about each child very individually and make sure you capture the essence of each child. And make sure you convey that to her in a way where she really gets the sense that you are minutely attuned to them. She'll be fine. So that's all he needs to know if he wants to be in a harmonious parenting relationship with her. All she needs to know is he just needs to feel that his parenting and his role as a father is appreciated, and that's all he wants.
Yeah. But unfortunately, we have all these things before that stop us getting to the point where we recognise what those things are for the other person.
Yeah. And as I've been saying, what's on offer to us, generally speaking, out there is not that. That's the thing that makes the difference. And that's the most important thing to do. Everything else is just noise, really. You can spend hours and thousands of pounds fighting with each other about a thing. And it was all just down to the lack of smile. Could have saved a lot of time and money and effort and angst by learning that smiling would solve the problem.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of looking at something in a relational aspect, it seems bizarre to me that we wouldn't look at the relationship or what was the issue in the relationship
Yeah.
rather than, you know, if you get the car or not. No
Yeah.
one like that's not the stem of the problem. The
It's
car
not. It's
wasn't
how
the
you
stem of
look
the
when you
issue.
talk about the car
It was
that matters.
it was
Yeah.
about what they why did they have such an issue over this?
Yeah.
Because they're feeling like they don't want to give them things and they're feeling
Yeah.
like
When
this
you
and
sort of, you say, I want the car, and you say it in a way that sort of implies that, you are entitled to it, and that from your point of view, the fact that the other person earned the money is irrelevant, they're going to go, no, you can't have the car. Whereas if you said, I really appreciate the fact that you were such a great provider. One of the lovely things about you, even though things didn't work out between us, was that you never stopped this constant sort of generous desire to provide for everyone. Yeah, sure, have the car. It's just a car.
yeah,
You see what I mean? The difference
I
it
feel
makes.
so much better now. You
Yeah,
can have the car.
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Who
And
cares about
why are
content?
people that deal
Yeah.
with separation not specialists in relationship?
Yeah.
Why people don't know anything about relationships, dealing with relationships? Sure, if you're prior to separation and you talk to someone about relationship, you will get someone who knows about relationships. Once you separate, though, all of a sudden, people who know about relationships are not who you're going to meet.
Yeah.
You're going to meet a lawyer who's not an expert in relationship. You're going to meet a mediator who's not an expert in relationship. Like, why do we suddenly forget about what makes relationships work when we separate?
Especially when there's children involved, because the relationship, it's not like you can just let go and move on and never talk to each other again. You will have to still be in some sort of relationship with that person, whether it's just, I don't know, going for coffee and talking about the fact that so and so's got this illness or so and so's doing bad in school or whatever. Or picking someone up from the partner's house. You're still going to have to cross paths with this person. You're still going to have some sort of relationship with them. So that dynamic of that relationship's completely changed. So maybe we need some way of figuring out what it's going to look like now that it has changed.
And maybe constructing a more appropriate relationship than you ever had.
Yeah.
So the relationship you started off with was good enough. You're young, you're single, you're fancy free. You can kind of, have dates and have holidays and, have a life whereby the relationship is looking after you well enough. But then times get tough. The relationship's not updated. It's you're using the old one. If you use like a metaphor, like imagine you're young and free and you get around on a scooter. It's good enough there's only two of you, So you use that sort of scooter type relationship for your whole life, and you suddenly got a family of 4 kids and a mortgage, and you're still trying to make do with the scooter. Like, you haven't updated the relationship. It's going to consistently let you down. And because your relationship lets you down, you're going to be unhappy with the other person. You're not going to think, oh, my relationship's letting me down at this moment by not providing us with the mechanism to talk, even though we're stressed and worried.
Yeah.
You're going to go, it's you.
And especially with the stress and worry, and especially with the topic that we're talking about now with attachment, it's like it's already initially not setting you up to be relational, to be questioning about why is this going wrong? Maybe we should have a look at this in some other way, being slightly more contextual about it, because you're already in these aspects of stress and feeling anxious and whatever. So you going back to those old style ways of thinking of, this is how I thought when I was young, and this is my survival instinct, and I'm stressed and everything's falling apart. And then all of a sudden, you're not really thinking about relationships anymore. You suddenly become like you didn't know what was going on in the first place. What's happening here? Why is this falling apart?
And also, I think every time you see that person's attachment schema at a difficult moment, you're going to define that person over time as in response to your assessment of what that behavior means. So let's suppose you've got an avoidant attachment schema, which means that you keep stuff to yourself. Every time you have an argument, that person keeps stuff to themselves. After a while, you say you're just cold-hearted. You're like a machine. You're only interested in your job or your mates, or you're not really a loving person. So therefore, I see that as the problem, and my concern is that you will never change. Well, of course, they're not going to change, because every time you have a row, you see that version of them. It's always going to be the same version. So you're going to think, this is who you are, this is what you're made of. And I think one of the big problems in relationships and optimism about the future in terms of parenting relationships is that both people have come to a view that the other one cannot change or will not change. People will often say, I'm stuck with this person forever. They can't change. The only way my life's going to get any better is if they die or have a lobotomy. Or maybe, find another partner. That person will never change. And I think that idea of, no, they won't change if you have a conflict with them. But if you approach them in a different way, they would be different. And so what we try to do in the sessions where we meet with the parents individually is we try and encourage them to acknowledge the other person's experience. We get them to say to themselves, okay, I can imagine what it must have felt like for you when we were going through that difficult time and I used to say those things to you. I've got the capacity to imagine what that would have felt like. I've got enough of a sense of internal kind of resilience or robustness to look at how I was and what it was like for you.
And that would be huge for the other partner.
Oh, amazing. So, at the end of our process, we're kind of encouraging people to say to the other person, look, I do have the capacity to know how that was for you. And to spontaneously offer that gift of acknowledgement. I've been thinking about how it must have been for you when we were going through those difficult times where I was away a lot and you were at home with the kids and one of the kids was sick. And I've realized over time how hard that must have been and how you must have felt so alone sometimes and so unsupported. And you must have felt I was only interested in work. You must have felt very, very deeply unappreciated and alone. It's just occurred to me. I'm not apologizing. I'm just acknowledging how that was for you. The other person's going to think, oh my God, if you could say that, what else would you be capable of saying? Like if you can acknowledge that, I'm now beginning to feel very optimistic about what we might be able to achieve because I thought you were unchangeable before. But now that you've said that, I've realized you have the capacity to reflect. I know I can see you have the capacity to think about how it might have been to be around you. And therefore, I'm not worried that you can't change because I've seen evidence that you can. So I think it's very important that people increasingly start to consider the power of acknowledgement and how it undoes that sense of inability to change. Because all of a sudden anything becomes possible. If you can acknowledge that, what else could you do? It's just limitless. So that sense of possibility starts to kick in. Wow, what else could we do? If you could do that, we could end up like having this really cool relationship where we see each other now and again, but it's super friendly and we hang out with each other and the kids love it as they float between the two of us. Dare to dream,
Yeah.
And so I think that sense of that acknowledgement begins that. So I always love it when someone goes, yeah, okay, I can do that. I can acknowledge that other person's experience. And as I say, it's not saying I did that to you. It's just saying I know how you felt.
And the thing is what's so fascinating about that is that you're saying that this small act of acknowledgement, a small act of saying, okay, I can see that you may have felt like that when I did this. Not saying that I did anything wrong, but I can see that would have made you feel like that. That can then therefore change to the aspect of actually seeing that this could be an optimistic thing in the future. Whatever maybe could be good, and actually those tiny little acts of acknowledgement or optimism or positivity between the two of them can then therefore equal what would have looked like an unchangeable situation. But actually, really those small things, those small cues, the positivity, the smile when you come in, I want you to say this to me when we see each other, those can equal something that could be really positive for a family alliance or a much easier family situation in terms of a separation.
Yeah. I think what it highlights is the process that you go in determines what you get. So I think a lot of people who work in the family law world think, look, I just get certain clients and some of them are just really stuck and what can I do? Without realizing that how you are with them changes what they're like with you. So if you are introducing the idea of optimism, of positivity and compassion as a thing, and you're introducing the idea that the relationship is eminently capable of adjustment and adaptation according to what your needs are, and you're referring to the fact that a lot of the conflict came from stuff that no one actually wanted because it was unconscious, Suddenly, you're creating a brand new reality where people are actually starting to think, I could do that. That's doable. So that's why I feel that everybody you see is talking about, let's make sure things don't get worse. Let's, err on the side of caution here. Let's not get optimistic because someone might let us down. It's so unhelpful. Building a positive future out of a negative past. It's just,
And I suppose the way that we've been talking about it, it's like you cue off what someone else gives you. You are building a relationship or a dynamic off what the other person is giving you over and over again, whether that's when you're a child or when you're in a new relationship. And if we as mediators or whoever go into a situation being like, oh, we can only be really careful and kind of a negative outlook on it, then we are cueing that negatively already. Like, we're doing what we already said we shouldn't be doing in the first place. We should be optimistic and positive about what the future could look like for a new reshape of the family and a new relationship. That will automatically make people more optimistic and positive towards you and the situation and the relationship in itself.
So you have to carry it for a while, because obviously they come in, they've got a history and it hasn't been good, and they've sort of been worn down by a relationship that hasn't worked properly. And, they're not bouncing into the room thinking this is a great opportunity to create a new parenting alliance, So to some extent, you have to embody that sense of this is totally doable. I often kind of like to speak to people as when your relationship is working really well and when you're getting on really well with each other, these are the sort of things that will be happening.
Forced positivity.
Yeah. You've got to drive it for a while.
Yeah.
I sometimes think relationships are like an economy. You've got to feed the economy with something to make it keep going well. Like if you have an economy with money has to be put into the system so that it goes through it and people all get some of it and it rolls along. Well, in relationship, it's the same. You've got to keep pushing compassion and kindness and forbearance and patience into the relationship, knowing that it'll come back and feed you too. If you use attrition, which is often what happens in relationships, you turn everything off and kind of act like the other person's not there, hoping that they'll somehow have this moment of insight into themselves and how it was for you to be. They're not. They're just going to hunker down in that state of attrition and just dig in and hold on to their positions and remind themselves that they're victims and pop into the warehouse of resentment every 5 minutes just to remind themselves of all the terrible things that have been done to them. So you've actually got to, and this kind of goes, you were saying in a previous podcast, Bella, where you're not really allowed as a mediator to kind of have a particularly powerful persona.
Yeah.
Whereas I think in that context, you do need to have a powerful persona. You need to be very powerfully advocating for a positive, exciting future.
Yeah.
Until it becomes more and more tangible, and then they can get on board with it. Think, yeah, I could do that.
Yeah, you can't beat pessimism with more pessimism.
You can't.
Out pessimism.
Yeah.
And the beautiful thing about implementing these new, this economy, this sort of well-functioning economy where we are feeding it positivity and compassion and kindness and appreciation, is so much easier to do now that you're not actually together. Like if it's a new shape, if the family is a new shape and the parents are not together anymore, they don't need to feed that economy every day because they're not going to be with each other every day. So it's actually more freeing. It's actually easier. You only need to provide that to the co-parenting alliance, every so often, because you're off. You're doing your own thing now. You're living your own lives. You've moved on.
Yeah.
Like it's sort of part of your history. So,
yeah, less high maintenance.
Exactly.
A co-parenting relationship is a lot less work than an everyday couple relationship.
Yeah. Although I'm sure people feel the opposite way.
Yeah, I'm sure it does feel
definitely.
that way. But actually, one smile a week,
will
is probably
make
enough
it
for a
worth it.
co-parenting because the rest of that week they'll just remember the smile.
Yeah.
So you don't have to kind of, when you're in a couple relationship, you've got to think every minute of every day, I'm about to make a cup of tea, there's only one tea bag. Shall I prioritize myself or the other person? Whereas when you're in a co-parenting relationship, you've got a lot more room to move. So actually, you can have a very sophisticated post-separation parenting relationship that doesn't require a lot of work.
Yeah.
But the kids just float between the two, feeling no sense of concern or worry. I'm not letting anyone down. I'm not abandoning someone. I'm not, I've got a sense that person's going to be okay when I'm not there. I'm not sort of making mum feel bad by spending time with dad. They just have this lovely sense of they're both fine. My parents are both committed to looking after each other, so I don't have to. it's a real luxury, I think, to have that
Yeah.
sense of freedom.
And that, feeds that secure attachment.
Yeah.
You know, you can still so powerfully advocate for secure attachment styles in your children.
Separated.
Yeah,
It's probably more likely than if you were in a bad relationship that's
Definitely.
maintaining
Mm.
its marriage or whatever.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it was really interesting. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
And thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you found it interesting and learned something new that you can maybe try in your own relationships. If this episode resonated with you, subscribe to Conflict to Connection and share it with someone who might benefit. You can also find resources on our website at civilizedseparations.co.uk. And next time we'll be discussing if and how you should tell your children you're getting a divorce. So subscribe now and follow along to find out more.